Since 1887, the Stonington Free Library has been a center for knowledge, ideas, creativity, and entertainment. It is a comfortable and welcoming community space for the town of Stonington, Connecticut, where all ages can explore, discover, gather, and learn within a building of distinctive and unique architecture. This video program is an evolution to expand the offerings of the library to share directly in your home or organization. Welcome to the Sunday evening lecture series made available to you by the Stonington Free Library.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Michaela Hall, Director of the Library. I want to thank you all for being here today and give special thanks to Deborah Goodrich Royce for presenting this program and for all the work that she has put into it, as well as for her support of the library over the years. Also, thank you to the rest of the staff and volunteers for their help in organizing this event. Like I've been saying, just please keep your cameras off and microphones muted unless asked by myself to turn them on to avoid any disruptions. If you have any questions throughout the program, please type them in the chat. Questions will be answered when we open up Q&A at the end. And I am recording the program. All personal information, such as names of participants, will be edited out before it is uploaded to our YouTube channel. I now turn it over to our program committee member, Catherine, to introduce Deborah.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Catherine Brandel, and I serve on the program committee and on the board of trustees for the Stonington Free Library. It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Deborah Goodrich Royce. Deborah's first novel, Finding Mrs. Ford, debuted in 2019 to rave reviews. She divides her time between the Northeast and Florida, where she writes, reads, watches a lot of movies, and spends time with her family. Deborah serves on the governing and advisory boards of the Avon Theater, the American Film Institute, the New York Botanical Gardens, the Greenwich International Film Festival, the Greenwich Historical Society, the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach, the Preservation Society of Newport, and the Prasad Project. She and her husband have restored more buildings than she can count, including the Ocean House Hotel and the Deer Mountain Inn. She has also been instrumental in restoring the United Theater in Westerly, and is a valued supporter of the Stonington Free Library. Deborah holds the BA in French and Italian from Lake Erie College and an honorary doctorate from the same institution. In an earlier life, she was an actress in film and television and a story editor for Miramax Films. Ruby Falls is her second psychological thriller, and she owes a debt of gratitude for its inspiration to Daphne du Maurier and Alfred Hitchcock. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Goodrich Royce.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for such a nice introduction. I absolutely adore your beautiful library, and I have such fond memories of being with you all in person 2 years ago. And I wish we were in person now, but on the other hand, I'm so glad we're doing what we're doing, and it's not a year ago. I mean, or 14 months ago, that moment when the world shut down completely and we all just froze in place, you know, D-Day, March 13th. But we'll talk more about that later. So here we are. I have a new novel called Ruby Falls. It is very much a double entendre, that title. I'm going to hold this as close to you as I can. It is the story of a little girl by the name of Ruby who is abandoned by her father in a cave when she is 6 years old. I'll begin by reading a tiny bit from the beginning of the book. I won't read too long. Prologue. Then, 1968, Lookout Mountain. I was standing with my father in the pitch black dark, the blackest dark I'd ever seen in the few short years of my young life, and the blackest dark that I've seen since, which is a considerably longer span. The surrounding air was dank with flecks from falling water. A disembodied voice rose up from the mist, then swooped back down to submerge in it. First amplified, then muffled, the sounds changed places, each taking its turn at prominence. The drone of the voice, the roar of the falls, and the clammy damp came at me from all directions, from the sides, from above and below, to seal me in a viscous coating and stick me to my spot. The waterfall could have been anywhere, next to me, yards away. I dared not move a muscle. The woman's words transfixed me with a tale of scuba divers, fearless swimmers who over the years had plumbed the depths of a fathomless pool in wetsuits and tanks, in masks and flippers. Down they had plunged into icy water in an effort to find its bottom. No search had been successful. The roiling cascade dropped into a lake that continued, it seemed, to the center of the earth, to China, to horrible depths my imagination was fully engaged in conjuring. Cold drops of perspiration ran down my face, my arms, and the back of my neck. I was concentrating hard, trying to locate the source of her voice, trying to pinpoint the crash of the falls, trying not to move and tumble in, and trying most heartily not to be afraid, when my father let go of my hand. That was it, really. That was all he did. He loosened his hand from my grip, and he disappeared, never to be seen again, while the tour guide never stopped talking. July the 12th, 1968, the last day I saw my father. So that's the beginning of the book. Our girl, Ruby, has gone with her father to Ruby Falls Cave, which is near Chattanooga, Tennessee, kind of the southeastern-most corner of Tennessee. And they've gone to this tourist attraction, this cave, where I certainly visited as a child, and I certainly remember them turning off the lights to complete blackness. I cannot imagine in my wildest dreams now that they could have done that, but that's how I remember it, and that's how I wrote it. So there she is with her father, and as you can tell from what I read, you know, the sound is all around her, echoing as it would in a cave. And her father, when the lights come back on, is gone. And because it's 1968, and I chose the time periods I did for very specific reasons to avoid technological issues. So there are no credit card records, there are no security cameras. The tour guides don't know who this little girl came into this cave with. They're obviously, she didn't come alone. She's 6 years old, but they're not quite sure who she came with. So they bring her up to the gift shop. They keep her there for a couple hours, and they call the police. The police come and get her. They keep her on a bench. And about 10 o'clock that night, her mother, so the family has come from Michigan to the South to visit relatives. The mother realizes that they're not just out to dinner. She calls the police station. They match up the little kid they have sitting on the bench. Mom comes to get her, and they're grounded in Chattanooga, Tennessee for the rest of the summer. The mother is answering questions, you know, involved with the search and the inquisition, and the child is in a state of shock. 20 years later, she becomes a young actress. She's ditched the name Ruby, and she goes simply by Eleanor Russell. Ruby was her middle name. And she's an actress in New York City on a soap opera. And she is written out of her soap under, you don't really know what the circumstances are. It is left very vague. She loses her job. Being written out of a television show is a euphemism for being fired. So she's fired. She goes to Europe. She meets a tall, dark, handsome stranger by the name of Orlando Montague, and she marries him. And they go to Rome on a honeymoon, and they are about to go into the catacombs under the earth. And she has, you know, understandably, an attack of claustrophobia and has to be escorted above ground. And she knows that this is right about the time she should tell this brand new husband of hers about this thing that happened in her childhood, but she doesn't. So she begins this marriage with a secret, and they move to Los Angeles, where they find the perfect cottage in the Hollywood Hills. And she's got the perfect husband, Orlando Montague, which I forgot to mention. He's quite a dish. He's Anglo-Chinese, which she finds very exotic. So he had a British father and a Chinese mother, and gorgeous British accent and very exotic looks to her. And life is off to a start. They have this perfect cottage, picket fence, roses tumbling over the picket fence. A stray kitten wanders up the path, so they have the perfect pet, and life is just perfect, which of course, you, the reader, are way ahead of the heroine. Life is never perfect. And she, Eleanor, is cast in a Paramount picture, a big studio picture, a remake of Rebecca, based on the Hitchcock film and the Daphne du Maurier book. And as this happens, all perfect components of life falling into place, Orlando starts to change, and he is not as nice or as charming as he was when she first met him. And she starts to realize that he has a secret or two of his own. So that is the setup of Ruby Falls. It's a psychological thriller, like my first novel, Finding Mrs. Ford, but it very much has Gothic tones to it. There was a big debate when with my publisher, when the book, there's a whole period when a book is about to come out where you're filling out all these forms of metadata, all bits of information to describe your book, to identify search words that you want people to have on the computer, and so forth. And I had been using the word Gothic, and my publisher said, well, why are you using Gothic? Or do you really mean that? And I know that there's kind of a genre of Gothic fiction now, which has to do with vampires, and it's very far down the supernatural path. My book is not that. My book is really like the Victorian Gothic books you grew up reading, like Rebecca, The Woman in White, Jane Eyre, and so on. What I like about the Gothic moniker, there's always a spooky tone in a Gothic piece of fiction. There's a period where you don't know if what is going on to disturb the heroine is supernatural or in the real world. And the heroine is always vulnerable. She has a fragility. There's always a man under whose sway she falls, who may be malevolent, he may be benign, and it's your job as the reader to sort that out. So there is very much a spooky Gothic feeling. And there's another book that came out this year that I think is a perfect sister book to Ruby Falls. If any of you have had the chance to read The Wife Upstairs, which I can't think of the author's name, she's from Alabama, and it's a play. She's playing around with Jane Eyre. In fact, she's retelling the story of Jane Eyre in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's a fantastic romp. It is more of a retelling of Jane Eyre than Ruby Falls is a retelling of Rebecca. My book is not a retelling. I take Rebecca as a launch pad, and from there I go off into new territory. So like Rebecca, we have a young, vulnerable girl in Europe who meets this dashing stranger, who marries him spontaneously, and who goes off to live in a particular place. So in Rebecca, of course, it was Manderley. You remember the first line, last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. So I love the fact that Manderley is almost like a character in Rebecca. The house has such a presence. It's almost like a living, breathing thing. In that book, it's really embodied through the person, too, of Mrs. Danvers. And, of course, the presence of the deceased wife, Rebecca. In Ruby Falls, I think I create something of that atmosphere with Los Angeles. So let's talk a little bit about LA. I lived in LA as a young actress. I lived there from 1984 to 1992. Very seminal place in my life. And I think for pretty much everyone on the entire planet, we have associations with LA and with Hollywood. We have all grown up in the modern era watching films, and LA is the place. So I set this book in not a majestic house like Manderley, in this teeny little cottage with the picket fence with these roses. I mean, it's just teeming with flowers. It is based on a house I lived in when I lived in LA many years ago, a house that no longer exists. And so I left LA in the early 90s. I was married. My children were small. I moved to Paris with my first husband. That's when I first began reading for a living. I started as a script reader for a French film studio before I went to Miramax when I moved back to New York. And the book, Ruby Falls, is dedicated to four very important friends. My agent at the time when I was an actress, and three very dear friends, all of whom died in the years after I left Los Angeles, all died very young. So I started going back to LA really in 2015. One of my daughters moved out there to pursue an acting career, and I started visiting her. And it was right when I was beginning the work on this book. And LA was overwhelming to me emotionally. And I mean, if you think about it, I don't know if you've lived in different places. I have lived here in Greenwich, Connecticut for 20 years. So when I go out of my house and I drive by the grocery store, or I drive by a particular cafe or the library or whatever, even if I had a traumatic experience at one of those places, I don't think of it every time I drive by it, because I'm in the habit of circulating around this town and seeing all of these places all the time. However, going back to LA after such a long absence, I was overcome emotionally. It was like a haunted city for me. And I would look at places and remember things that had happened and remember exchanges I'd had here or there. I think my daughter thought I was a little nutty. And of course, I've gotten over that. But I think it very much seeped into the feeling of this book, this feeling of Hollywood as a place inhabited by ghosts. Kirkus Reviews referred to Ruby Falls as inhabiting a hallucinatory Hollywood. So I think there's very much that feeling. Another theme I'm playing with in Ruby Falls is the idea of trauma and the after effects of trauma, and how we cope with it or don't cope with it, and the effects of trauma later in life. So our girl, when she's a child, experiences something very horrific with her father leaving her in this cave. It's about as horrible as it can get. It is absolutely terrifying. And he's never to be seen again. And she latches onto this. It becomes a quest of her life to solve the issue of what happened to dear old dad. The tour guide, if you recall, was talking about divers having explored this underground lake and never being able to find the bottom. So she doesn't know if he fell in the water. She doesn't know if he took off because he was involved in something really important. So she does, in the course of the book, talk about and research. She goes to a library to research the conspiracies of the time. And if you think about the 1960s, I think really the big conspiracy of that time was, of course, the Kennedy assassination. So she has latched onto that because her name is Ruby, and because of Jack Ruby. She fixates a bit on whether or not her father could have had some involvement. Did he have to disappear? Was he with the CIA or the KGB, or some involvement with the Cubans, or this thing that is real called the Dixie Mafia? And I've read a couple of books about it. She researches all of that, and the book has been optioned by a Hollywood producer. And he asked me if I would mind if they made it a contemporary story. And I don't necessarily mind, but there are two very large categories you would have to conquer. One is just technology as a whole. Her abandonment in the cave is facilitated, if you will, by the fact that her father's just untrackable. In the modern era, I just don't know how you would have somebody so untrackable. And the other thing is, if you had a young woman who went down the conspiracy rabbit hole, now, wow, you could go very far down the internet lanes, and I don't know how much I would enjoy that. So we'll see what happens to that. So just to bring you up to speed a little bit about me, I don't know if you tuned in 2 years ago, I was an actress. I did start on a soap opera. I did a lot of films and television. That was all in the 80s and the early 90s. Through a move to Paris with my first husband, because he'd grown up and we went back there, I was hired first by a French film studio as a reader. And then when we moved back to New York, I was hired by Harvey Weinstein as the story editor at Miramax. And I worked there in the 90s. And a story editor is really like a book editor. So for me, the 90s were like my graduate school of writing, having this opportunity to edit the work of obviously far greater writers than I began to really hone my understanding of writing and what worked with story and structure and character, et cetera. Going into the 2000s, I went through a really very painful divorce and then a wonderful remarriage, and moved to Connecticut, where my first husband and my second husband, the man I'm married to now, Chuck Royce, whom you may know, and he's very involved in Westerly, we restored a cinema in Stamford, Connecticut called the Avon. And the actor Gene Wilder became very involved with the cinema. He had a house in Stamford, and we had a 10-year involvement with him and the Avon. And he would come every autumn and talk about movies to our audiences. And it was really terrific. And in that relationship, because we emailed each other all the time, and he said to me at a certain point, "Are you a writer? I think you're a writer." And of course, I had been writing. I'd written a screenplay with a writing partner. We'd gotten a grant for it, put it in that famous drawer where many secret writers keep their secret writing. I was in a couple of writing groups, but it was through Gene Wilder's encouragement. He read the screenplay, was very encouraging. And every time I'd see him after that, he would say to me, "Are you writing? I hope you're writing." And it was 2014, the year when my youngest child really grew up and left the house, that I put my attention in a serious way to writing. And then from 14 to 19 was a 5-year period where I wrote the first book, was working on the second book, got an agent, went through all kinds of submissions and rejections, got a publisher. First book came out in 19, second book came out this year. So it's been a journey that has been a wonderful and exciting and stimulating journey. And I would venture a guess that my journey is not so very different from many people. I mean, I may have been in industries that are a little bit more attention getting than some other industries, but I think we all do reinvent ourselves over time, particularly in the modern world. And so part of the reason I'm interested in this, I would say that the kinds of thrillers I write really deal with identity. I dive into this concept of who people are. I find it the most fascinating thing, what they reveal and what they conceal, of course. And that becomes the basis of what I am dangling in front of the reader and leading the reader along to find out what is this character or what are these characters hiding. So a couple of real life points along the way there. I mentioned that I worked for Harvey Weinstein. So, I mean, that is pertinent to the types of things I write. I don't write specifically about what happened with him what he engaged in. And so I didn't know in working for him about his escapades on the side. I certainly don't doubt the women, and I don't disparage the women, and I give them tremendous credit for coming forward and exposing all of that. But to me, it's a reminder that people compartmentalize and they reveal selected aspects of themselves to different people. And I'm not blaming victims. I don't think victims do anything wrong to sort of elicit the predator face of a predator. But I think, you think about the pedophile priests. I mean, not everybody knew they were pedophile priests. They picked the most vulnerable. So I did work for Harvey Weinstein. I didn't work in his office. I didn't make his appointments. I didn't know him personally. But I have this debt of gratitude to him for giving me a chance as a former actress to hire me as an editor. It was a big deal. And Miramax was very important to me in my development. Another little story I like to tell about this idea of people and their secrets. When I was an actress in the 80s, one of the jobs I did was a TV movie about the serial killer, Ted Bundy. And I played the woman who actually married Bundy. I don't know if you know, but there was a woman who really followed him from Seattle down to Florida when he was on his last murder trial, which was horribly gruesome. And he put her on the witness stand and said, certain key words. Will you marry me? She said, yes. He said, then I do hereby marry you, which rendered it legal and binding. And so she married him. I played her. The character is very watered down in I can't remember if it was just a TV movie or if it was a mini series that we did about that. But so I thought about that as I was playing her, what on earth was she thinking? How, to us now, it is really evident that he was an absolute psychopath, serial killer. I can only imagine that if she married him, she didn't believe that was true. And how could that be? They say he was very charming. There was a writer called Anne Rule who wrote a book about him called The Stranger Beside Me. And that was really the main source book for the project that we did. Our project ended up being called The Deliberate Stranger. But anyway, I'm intrigued by that. This idea that people aren't always what they seem, and they don't always tell you about themselves. So I have just finished working on a third book, which I am tentatively calling Reef Road. And I slow myself down to pronounce that so you understand me. The first word is reef, like coral reef, road, and it's a street in Palm Beach, Florida. So when the pandemic hit last year, March the 13th is my granddaughter's birthday. And that was kind of D-Day. We were in Florida. We have a house there. My daughter had a little teeny gathering for my granddaughter's first birthday. And it became, that was the day where you realized you weren't going anywhere. So there I was in Florida. I had been on a book tour for Finding Mrs. Ford. That ended, obviously. And I decided to delve into some research that I'd been wanting to do. So my own mother's best friend was savagely murdered in 1948 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when she and my mother were 12 years old. It was a December night. My mother had been invited to go to this girl's house. The girl's parents had gone out bowling. For whatever reason, my grandmother said no. The parents came home from bowling and they found her stabbed 36 times on the floor next to the telephone table, and a trail of blood from the kitchen to the telephone table in the dining room. It's an unsolved crime. The brother, who was 6 years older, was arrested 4 times over the ensuing years for the murder of his sister. He's still alive. And what intrigues me about that I think it is a well-known syndrome that people who often exist next door to extreme acts of violence, and I mean a metaphorical next door, I don't mean actual. My mother was not actually next door. She lived a few streets away. But people who are in close proximity to extreme violence like that, it has an effect on them, often forever. An act of violence doesn't exist in a vacuum. If you think of the Dennis Lehane book, Mystic River, and they made a movie of it. If you think of someone like Dominic Dunn, who became a very important chronicler of famous murder trials after his own daughter was horribly murdered by a boyfriend in Hollywood. If you think about Michelle McNamara, she wrote I'll Be Gone in the Dark a couple of years ago, and then she died before the actual Golden State Killer was found. And then they've made a mini series about I'll Be Gone in the Dark. She grew up in Illinois, and there was a girl killed in her neighborhood. And I think it was an unsolved crime. And I think so. Thinking about my mother and the effect it had on her, she was very overprotective. She was very worried about being at home. Home always worried her because that's where it happened. She needed to have doors locked. New home alarm systems have been a really terrific thing for my mother. She feels much more secure at home. So when the pandemic struck, I started to look really in depth at what happened to this girl. And there's a tremendous amount of material on the internet because her brother is still alive and in his 90s. And I didn't want to write nonfiction about this. I just don't want to delve into it that way. So I fictionalized that. So Reef Road happens in the pandemic in Palm Beach in those really intense months of March, April, May of 2020. And there are two narratives. There's a story of a middle-aged writer who lives alone with her dog behind the grocery store in kind of a dreary apartment and spends her time researching the murder of her mother's best friend and other murders and kind of waxing philosophical about this topic in general. And they're alternating chapters, which it's like a book within a book. They have their own chapter structure and it has a title. And it's the story of a woman named Linda Alonso, a 40-year-old woman who's married to an Argentine man, Miguel Alonso. And Miguel and the children disappear on a plane to Buenos Aires in those really severe lockdown days of the pandemic. She can't follow him because Argentina has closed to all but Argentine nationals coming home. So there are these two stories, and how they intersect becomes a lot of the point and the fun of the thriller. So I've just turned that into an editor, and she's a wonderful editor. She edited Ruby Falls. I really trust her. So I'm at that point where I'm anxious to see, does this work? Do these two kind of these narratives that have really different rhythms, do they work together? I like it. I like going from this kind of philosophical musing back to the storyline, but we'll see what my editor says. So that's what I've been working on lately in this past year. And that really kind of brings us up to the present moment. Oh, I want to tell you, Finding Mrs. Ford, I think when I talked to you last, the book had already been optioned by 2 Hollywood producers, but an actress has finally attached. And she's such a phenomenal actress. And I'm teasing you now because I'm not allowed to tell you who she is. She has said that she wants to wait until they bring the screenwriter on board and she approves of the screenwriter before we're allowed to make an announcement. So I'm kind of champing at the bit to do that. But all I can say is she's someone very much in our consciousness now. You'll know who she is, and she's just wonderful. So both the first book and the second book are, going down the yellow brick road of Hollywood in some way or another, and crossing fingers that those things happen. And I'd love to take your questions about any aspect of life or writing or any of the books, not spoilers, I guess, because I suspect there are people on here who have not read Ruby Falls, and we wouldn't want to spoil the twist. But any other questions you have, I'd love to engage with you that way.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And we hope to have you back for your next book. Absolutely.
Thank
And we'll be
you.
in person then. And congratulations
Yay!
on the movie option. So we do have one question in the chat. And if anyone else would like to put questions in the chat, go ahead. And then I'll also allow you in a moment to unmute, and I will call on you if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud. But let's start with the questions in the chat. This is from Kevin. Did you know that a new movie of Rebecca would be released? Did that cause any issues with the book?
Great question, Kevin. I did not know that. I started Ruby Falls in 2016. Rebecca came out last fall. You know, when I heard about it coming out, the only thing I thought is, oh, well, maybe this will just put Rebecca a little bit more into the consciousness of younger people who may not have been so tied into the Hitchcock film. I don't think that movie made a big splash. I know that Mr. Hammer had some personal issues after that. And so I think it kind of disappeared a little bit. So again, Ruby Falls is not a remake of Rebecca. It is kind of flight of fancy from the original premise of Rebecca. So no, I don't think so. You know, one thing I will talk to you about is the cover. So this cover, if you can see this, it's a photograph, and the face is kind of sliced and diced, and you know, her face is intact, but then you see bits of her face from the side. And this is an artist by the name of Melanie Wilhide. She has an MFA from Yale, and there was a point in time where she was out in, I think, Pasadena, getting ready to do a gallery show in LA, and her computer was stolen. And 3 weeks later, the police found her computer, gave it back to her, and when she tried to retrieve her work, this is how it all came out. And so she created the show all around that error, that thing that happened to these photos that almost disappeared. This was a new photo, but it went into the show, and the show was called To Adrian Rodriguez with Love. Adrian Rodriguez was the name of the man who stole her computer. And this, you know, you see a bigger slice of it on the banner. This work is called Grace and Thorns. And I really cannot think of a better work of art to coincide with Ruby Falls. And one little Watch Hill story, Scott Swift, who comes to Watch Hill a lot, who is Taylor Swift's father. I do not know Taylor Swift, but I know her father from Watch Hill. So we were having coffee in January. So I wasn't even sure if the book had gone to print yet. And I told him the story. He said, you need to put that story in the back of the book. People are interested in this dovetailing of different works of art. And he was talking about his daughter, who often gives a little shout out to different artists. I guess he said there's a muralist in Nashville that she had spoken about, and this muralist career really took off after that. So based on his advice, when you go to the back of the book, I have a paragraph that really tells the story that I just relayed to you.
Thank you, Deborah. We have another question in the chat, this one from Deborah. Do you have a target audience in terms of age? Might a young audience become engaged with this book?
That's a really great question. I don't necessarily have a target audience. I do think a young audience could become engaged with this. I've noticed on Goodreads, some of the readers who I think just love the book beyond description seem to me to be younger. I don't really know. They've compared the book a lot to, there are about 3 or 4 Goodreads reviewers who've compared it to Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. I haven't read that yet. I'm scared to read it. I just bought it. I know I think it's way scarier than my book, but I was asking somebody, why they were comparing Ruby Falls to The Haunting of Hill House. But there's this feeling of something about to happen in the book. And if I were to think of movie comps that would be good comps for this, I would say movies like The Sixth Sense or Black Swan, where things are not what they seem. And those, I think, appeal to a younger audience.
So that was our last question in the chat, but if you would prefer to ask your question out loud, go ahead and unmute yourself and I will call on you just so not everyone is talking over each other at the same time. If you'd like to ask your question out loud, go ahead and unmute.
We're doing an event at the Avon Theater in Stamford on Wednesday. I know that's a little far for you, but it'll be a live event. And I'll be doing a Q&A with Bill Baker, who used to run our public television in New York, Channel 13 for years. He's an incredible person and a film producer. And then, so we'll have, drinks and snacks and stuff. We'll do that little cocktail part outside, then we'll go in, have people space, and then we will show the Hitchcock version of Rebecca, which will be a lot of fun. So if you feel like driving, it's probably an hour and a half from where you are to Stamford, not so far, if you want to do a field trip.
Very nice. And we do have another question in the chat from Colleen. Can you describe how you found an agent, the agent, a publisher, etc., and have these relationships stayed in place?
Excellent question. So I'm going to start with the agent. I got an agent for my first book through a dear friend. My dear friend, Linda Munger, whose husband has been on the board of, I think, Mystic Seaport for years. She had produced a couple of films. And she had a relationship with Creative Artists Agency. And she showed Finding Mrs. Ford to a packaging agent at CAA, who sent it over to a literary agent who called me, who said, your writing is absolutely gorgeous. And, she said she was gobsmacked by the surprise in the middle of the book. So we started working together. And so that would have been 2015. And she remained my agent through the whole process of Finding Mrs. Ford. And we parted ways for my second book. And I went with a smaller agent. Her name is Beth Davey, and she's here in Greenwich. For me, that has been a more fulfilling relationship. I have felt more of a peer-to-peer adult relationship with someone to whom I have access, whereas CAA was just so large, and I always felt, and I'm not blaming anyone for this, a little bit infantilized. And anyway, that just didn't work out. And I'm grateful to CAA, and Finding Mrs. Ford is still with CAA, and they're handling, all of the film, television stuff that's going on right now with Finding Mrs. Ford. Getting a publisher. So for the first book, Finding Mrs. Ford was rejected by about 35 different publishing houses. And finally, at the same point in time, I had two offers. One from a really hybrid publishing company in California called She Writes Press, and one from a smaller publishing house that's distributed by Simon & Schuster called Post Hill Press. And I went with Post Hill Press. They have a smaller fiction wing. They have a huge nonfiction wing. And I've been very happy there. I felt, I felt like an adult. I've had great input over my covers. I've had great input over my actual publication date. I have felt like, an adult partner in the process, where I've heard from some friends who maybe have bigger publishing houses, and that seems really great at first. And sometimes it is, I don't really know. But for some people, if you're not among their bigger clients, their bigger authors, you can get really shoved to the side. generally speaking, the process of getting an agent is through this query letter process. I didn't go through that. So that's been my process.
Thank you, Deborah. So no more questions in the chat right now, but I'll give everyone another chance. You can type a question in the chat, and if you'd like to ask your question out loud, go ahead and unmute and I will call on you. Give everyone a second.
The other thing I can recommend as writers is I strongly recommend joining a writers group with kind-hearted souls, people who, and that was very helpful for me long before I'd really even started writing a novel. I'd been writing in writers groups here in Connecticut for years. And I think there's something, it's very helpful when people start to recognize your voice and what is unique about your voice and the way you say things. Because often when you're a writer, you think you have to go in and write like other people and whoever it is, or, whether it's, Ernest Hemingway or someone like Gillian Flynn, who's the queen of the contemporary thriller. But when you're in a writing group with other people, it becomes very meaningful when people say, oh, I like the way you do this. And you start to gain confidence in your own voice. So I encourage that very highly.
Great point. And we hope to get one started at the library in the near future. Writers.
Nice, really nice.
Yes, we have someone who is interested in it. Well, that is all the questions that we have. Thank you so much, Deborah. We truly appreciate you presenting this program. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this beautiful day. Take care, everyone. And Deborah,
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.